Join us.
They used to call me Crazy Joe, but now they can call me Batman.
Well, welcome back once again to the Necro Zoo. I am Booms. And in this one, let's go ahead and add one more figure to my McFarlane DC Multiverse collection. Now this time it will be Mr. Freeze. Now it's been a long time since I've added a Mr. Freeze to my DC figure collection. I mean, ever since I think DC Superheroes and Mattel, that's the the last time I actually picked up a Mr. Freeze. So I'm actually pretty excited about this figure. Looks rather interesting, but let's not stand on ceremony. Now he does look pretty chill in the packaging, but let's go ahead and take a closer look at him. But first, he does come with your standard black DC Multiverse stand. Now, of course, these are not really needed, but sometimes they do come in useful. He also comes with his data file card. On the front, you do have some source material. Now, this is not really representative of the action figure. You could change the color scheme a little bit and kind of get more of this version. Not necessarily for sure which version of Mr. Freeze this is, but if you look in the comics, there's tons of different versions of Senor Freeze. So all in all, pretty happy with that. On the back, you do have some information. So that's pretty cool. We'll add that to the collection. Now he does come with one accessory, and surprisingly, that is his freeze gun. Now it's been a while since we've actually received an actual kind of gun weapon from McFarlane, but this one's in a pretty basic gray color scheme with a little tip with some freeze ray coming out of it. But I thought this would be easy to remove from here, but the more I twist it, it doesn't want to come free. And I did heat it up, but it still didn't want to break free, so I might have to resort to modding this thing, but we'll check that out later on in the video. But all in all, pretty nice. Like I said, been a while since we've gotten some sort of weapon from McFarlane, so that's pretty cool. But let's go ahead and take a closer look at him. Now, first impressions, pretty much digging it. I know a lot of people were turned off by the color scheme of this one. Kind of pale, kind of real tint of blue on it, on the armor. And then you have another part that's more like a grayish white. So, you know, usually when you see an image of Mr. Freeze, you do see more of a metallic blue or, you know, frost blue kind of color scheme. But what's cool is that we do now have this mold in the line, and we can add on to this or get different color schemes of this figure. So, you know, all in all, it's all good that we got a Mr. Freeze, regardless of what the color scheme is. But for what it is, it looks pretty awesome. He has his tubes, a lot of little gauges, little buttons and and thingamabobs on there. So it makes for an interesting sculpt. If not, it's a little bit soft. Like some of the sculpt isn't really like prominent. It's like kind of soft. Like you could barely make out that it's a nut or a bolt, or you could barely make out that it's a buckle. But I won't I won't complain too much. It's you know, it looks pretty good. Let's take a look at the head sculpt now. The head sculpt is encased in his, you know, dome that he usually wears, you know, to keep his body cool, to regulate his temperature. Now this is removable. You just, you know, work it up, pop it off. It does have like a little notch so that you could be sure that it fits back in its original position. Now, one thing for sure, the head sculpt on here is really nice. I just love like the bald head, the goggles, all the little, dents on his, you could see it, every little wrinkle and frown in his brow. You could see all that stuff in there. So the ear, even the ears are sculpted out really nice. I mean, the head sculpt does not disappoint. It looks really good. One thing that is kind of a letdown is that besides the dome, it has like a little bit of frostiness to it. It's not really clear. Now, that's not a big deal because, I mean, you can imagine that inside of his dome, you could kind of take it as a little bit of, like breath or mist in there. But what's wrong with it is that if you move his head and you try and put the dome back on, it actually like moves his head back down because it will not, like completely set free. Now, you can turn his head and put the dome back on, but you can't really look up or really down without it affecting the way the dome goes back on. Speaking of that, let's take a look at the articulation. He looks down really well. Also looks up really well. Oh, that's an awesome head sculpt. Looks up really well, actually displaying that beautiful head sculpt. You got right to left, and of course you can tilt his head for some attitude. And you put the dome back on, you got to make sure the notch like fits right in there. But it does kind of move his head back to a neutral position. So there's not really no fix for that. But basically, as long as you could turn him and get him in some different head poses, it's not too bad. Now, before we move on, let's look once again at the chest armor. As I said before, he does have like different little buttons and like gauges and different lines of texture. The only thing is that, like I said, they're kind of muddled. They don't really stick out that well. I don't know if the paint had something to do with that. But he does have like his harness that like to hold the suit on. So, you do get some details in there, and when you move down, he has a really nice belt that just has like little sections and little sculpt detail. And you and you gotta talk about this like color. I don't really know what to call it. It's kind of like a pastel green, in between a green and a blue, but it kind of matches the paint on his head, but not really. That's more of a blue. But I don't know why they went with that color, but it is what it is. Let's take a look at the waist articulation. You do get side to side. Actually, really nice, smooth articulation there. You got that whole tilt-a-whirl at the waist. Lower waist swivel, upper chest swivel. You do have a crunch. It is, there, not the best, but you do have a crunch. And of course, he could lean back really well. All this really free articulation means that you could twist him, get him in some cool poses. So all in all, pretty standard from McFarlane at the waist. But now let's take a look at the shoulder. Now, he does have these pauldrons on his shoulder, and when you move it, you have to be careful of those when you like lift up his shoulders so they ride up above his harness, but they do work pretty good. And then of course it does have the butterfly joint in there, you could see it, and the shoulder has a lot of range, so that means you do get up and down, front to back. And now we're really going to get interesting in here. There is a bicep cut, but he does only have single jointed elbows. You could still reach back pretty well, but you can tell that it's only single jointed, and that's where we get into the interesting new, execution of articulation. Now, first off, this looks pinless. You cannot see any pins on the upper, like under the bicep or on the forearm, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't have pins. Now, this is kind of hard to explain, but what it is it's kind of like like an exoskeleton. So the elbow joint is underneath these two pieces, and it still moves and swivels, and you can actually see the pins under this. But when you look at the actual arm of the figure, it looks pinless, which I'm not against going pinless. I think the only big negative about going pinless is it's kind of hard to take apart pinless, pieces like for customization. But I mean, if that's not a big deal to you, or if we're talking about aesthetics, pinless is the way to go. It always has been. But this makes it look kind of like a faux pinless arm. But what it really is that joint underneath allows for elbow swivel. Very reminiscent of like the Megafigs. So what's cool about that is you get more range in the arm, but you don't have that double jointed elbow. But as I said before, you start at the shoulder, you got those guards, shoulder guards, and then move down. Nice sculpted out arm design. And then when you get into the gauntlets, this one's pretty cool. The left one has like some gauges, and you could even see that it's right about 20 degrees. And then goes down into a hand. You, of course, do have the wrist ball joint that gives you, twist and hinge. And this hand is more of just like a clasping hand. But on the other side, it doesn't have the same gauges, so it is a different sculpt. But you do have the trigger hand to hold on to his freeze gun. So all in all, rather interesting. Looks like pinless, but it's not pin. I mean, it is pinless, but the pins are hidden. But I would rather have hidden pins that give you the same articulation than actual exposed pins. Now you can get them pretty easily in a T-pose. Can actually get a little bit more, but not much more. You could move his arms up above his head. And then, of course, what was cool about those articulated elbows was that you can actually clasp his hands behind him. Pretty interesting. Now, moving down, let's go to the thighs. Check out his thigh swivel. Now, he does have pretty good thigh swivel. It's not the best, but it's there. He can kick up respectively. And, of course, he could kick back really high. Now, don't be afraid because when you put them back to their original position, they go back to their original form. But you can cock out his knee and bend it. You got that cool hip swivel, double jointed knees, straighten them out. Now, this is another part where it gets really interesting, and that is that you do have up and down at the ankle. You got that regular ankle ball joint, but it's actually hidden really well. You do got right to left, rocker, and of course toe articulation. But as a big surprise to me, you do have a boot cut. So if you want to move the boot, you just have to swivel it. Now at first I thought it was the guard because McFarlane he's had like that floating shin guard, but no, it's actually the boot cut that swivels, because if you check the other one, and when I moved mine, it actually popped. It made a noise like where it broke free. But no, it is an actual boot cut on this Mr. Freeze. Now, I'm not against cuts, even thigh cuts, if they're hidden. Like if you take the Death Metal Batman, he had those like spiked belts around his thighs. So that made a perfect line to give him a thigh cut. But what I don't like is where there's just plain musculature and you cut it. That way when you turn that thigh, it just rips, puts the musculature, off balance, and it looks really ugly. But if there is a cut there that's hidden, then I'm all for it. Just like these boot cuts. Now you can more easily move the boots without having to move the leg. Now you can't, with his thigh swivel that he has, you can still move the boot back and forth by just moving the thigh. But now you have that added little, just to give it a little bit more with that boot cut. And before we go, let's take a look at the whole lower body. Like I said before, it's kind of The sculpture is there. You can see the buckles on his legs, like the little bolts and stuff like that. But the thing is that they're really soft. You can't really see the detail in it, but they are there on both sides. Even the boots have tons of little sculpted detail. I mean, it's not too bad, but maybe like a different paint or some wash would actually bring out that sculpt work. Take a look at him from the bottom. Now, he does have some outer tread, which gives some style to his boots, and then he does have some identifying marks. Moving up the back, you do have some nice sculpt work in the back of the boots, going into the knees and into the upper thighs. One thing that I did not like also is that they didn't paint this pin on the inner part of the quad. So that's one thing I will have to repaint, because it's just like like a pet peeve of mine. I can't let it rest, so I will be repainting that. Do not worry. But moving up the back, you got the back of that cool belt. And then here is another time when the sculpt is there, but it's just really soft. And what I mean by that is that you could see it, but it doesn't have a lot of crisp detail. It's kind of blurred a little bit. So you have like that kind of metal, hammered metal tanks. And then you have some gauges, some little valve shutoffs and stuff like that. But you just can't really see them as well as I would think you would be able to. He even has some like on the side. Like, this is a lot of cool sculpt work, from the tanks to the harness to all the gauges to even like you got some vents here on the back of his shoulders. But the thing is, it's just really like not defined. But it's not. It doesn't take too much points away from it. It's still an awesome figure. And like I said, maybe one day we'll get a repaint of this guy or another Mr. Freeze. So not too bad at all. Pretty cool. Now, before we move on, what should we tackle first? Let's look at his freeze gun. Now, you can place this in his hand and have him holding it. But, of course, I want to make this freeze blast kind of removable. So what I ended up doing, of course, was cutting it. So I cut both ends and separated them. And then what I ended up doing was actually drilling a hole in the gun part, and then drilling a hole in like the tip and the blast part. So now you know I have two like corresponding holes on each end. And then I do have these little plastics that I usually use that they're about as thick as a pencil lead, but they're hard plastic. They will not break. Like, I put these in and put a lot of pressure, and they will not break. They're just like little strong pieces of plastic. And I end up putting one end into the blast effect. So now you got that little hard pin sticking out, and now it makes the gun be able to have two versions without blast, where he's just carrying it around, and then putting it with the... Either way, you could put it in his hand and display it. Now the next thing I want to do is, let's go ahead and bring out like the only Mr. Freezes that I have in my collection, which of course are that Mattel Mr. Freeze that started at Superpowers and ended, I think, in Batman Legacy. But I do have 5 different versions, so pretty interesting. I do have this like standard blue version that came out, and then I also have the kind of like crop top version. There was another version that came out with a different color scheme, and then in the Legacy they released this like kind of Superpowers inspired version with the different colors and the tinted dome, which is pretty sweet. Then I have a repainted metallic blue version. And then the last is the coup de grace, and that is I think it was a New York Comic-Con exclusive. Now, you don't really see this one a lot. It's like a rare paint version that they did, which is more like black with some like blood red in it. But I do have all these versions. I had to pull them out and shake the dust off of them, but they are in my collection. Pretty cool figures to have in the collection. And then the last thing I want to talk about, of course, is the height. Now, the height is the problem. Now, a lot of people were mad. They said that he was kind of short. Now, I did look this up, and Batman is 6'2", and Mr. Freeze is 6 foot. But the thing is, he wears a suit with like some, big boots and the armor and all that. So when you put him, I think, the year 2 Batman. Yeah, Batman is like, a little bit taller, actually a good piece taller than this Mr. Freeze. But of course, I went back and did the little thigh trick that you actually use the clips on the inner thighs that hook onto the harness where his, pelvis is. And I warmed them up, popped them out, and then put them back in, but not all the way. And what's pretty cool is that you can't actually see any difference. In fact, you get a little bit more dexterity in the thigh swivel and, movement. But if you look at them from the back, it still looks good. If you look at them from the front, there's like no obvious, differences. But when you go ahead and put them once again in front of that Batman year 2, now they're more like looking eye to eye. So it did raise them up a little bit. So, I mean, it's not the perfect fix, but it's better than nothing. Does look, doesn't look like you changed anything, but it does give them a little bit more height. And actually, since that year 2 Batman is pretty tall compared to all of the other DC Multiverse figures, well, most of them, now the Mr. Freeze is actually pretty tall compared to all of the other figures. But anyways, guys, he's pretty cool. I like him. I'm going to put him up on the shelf, put him in some cool poses, maybe, take some photography with him. Pretty happy to have him in the collection, but you guys keep hunting out there, keep collecting, keep customizing, and I will see you on the next one.
They used to call me Crazy Joe, but now they can call me Batman.